So welcome everybody to Makdisi Street podcast. I'm Karim Makdisi in Beirut, and my brothers Osama and Sari are in California. And we're really very, very happy to have a guest today for discussion, Francesca Albanese, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, which I think she began in May of 2022. And of course, we'd like to, and of course, Francesca also has a very long and distinguished career in and out of academia at the UN and other all sorts of advocacy. And we're very, very happy to have her. So with that, I'd like, Francesca, if you don't mind, just beginning to introduce yourself a little bit more, and also what it that a special rapporteur does exactly.
Thank you very much for having me. Special Rapporteur of the United Nations is a technical expert who's mandated by the Human Rights Council to investigate and report on violations of international law, either on a given topic, for example, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, the protection of human rights defenders, or on given territories. Like Myanmar, Iran, and the Occupied Palestinian Territory. This is one of the longest mandates. It's been on for 30 years now. I am the 8th special rapporteur and the first woman on this role. And so what I'm mandated to do by the United Nations is to investigate and report on violations of international law occurring in the territory that Israel has occupied since 1967, so the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And normally these reports should be based on country visits twice a year. But since 2007, Israel has steadily prevented special rapporteurs serving on this job from entering the occupied Palestinian territory. So we have to be very creative on how we get the information for our reports.
Yeah, could I just ask? So I know you've been, I mean, everybody kind of understands that you've been under a lot of pressure, especially from the beginning, but especially over the past 6 weeks or so, also under attack by certain places and certain people. And I'm wondering, and as were your predecessors to that as well in this particular position. So how do you deal with that? I mean, there must be a lot of pressure personally, but also, do you get this kind of support that you expect from the UN, from the Secretary General's office, from the Human Rights Council people? I know you're not an employee of the UN, but is there a way in which you get that kind of protection, or are you basically on your own?
No, I wouldn't say I'm on my own, but so let's unpack the several questions that you asked, because all of them are very, very important. So first of all, yes, this is a honorary job, but it's a pretty important job. So a special rapporteur has the rank of an assistant secretary general. So the support we get is of various types, is first and foremost from the United Nations, because yes, I have open doors in the UN system. There is one staff member that supports my mandate from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I have splendid relations with the other special rapporteurs, and there is a general good flow of information that comes from the UN, but also goes from my mandate to the UN system. Yes, I've been under attack since the very beginning of my mandate. In fact, since even before becoming a special rapporteur, because of my scholarship, because of my work, and because of my advocacy. I mean, as a human rights lawyer, I've always been adamant on certain patterns of violations of international law that characterizes Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, and in fact, Israel's presence in Palestine, first and foremost. How do I leave the attacks? There is a continuous smear of anyone who utters words of criticism vis-a-vis Israel. So the attacks range from the heinous allegations of anti-Semitism, which for me has always been the hardest to deal with, because as a European and as someone who grew up in a country which in fact has contributed to send many of our Jewish citizens, Italian Jews, to die because they were Jews. I'm very familiar of what it is, anti-Semitism, and clearly I don't want to be on the receiving end of this attack, because my very function as a human rights lawyer is to stand against anything that animates anti-Semitism. But however, I also know, like my predecessors, that these kind of allegations are used as Richard Falk, one of my esteemed predecessors, says, as a tactic to deflect the attention from what we try to bring forward in terms of knowledge. What are Israelis' policies and practices vis-a-vis the Palestinians? Then, of course, there are other allegations that I support Hamas, which is not the case, or that I incite violence, which is, again, I don't want to comment on each and every idiocy that is formulated. But look, these accusations come and go. What is more important is, and this is really what pierces my heart, is the reality on the ground. This is what I find obscene. This is what I find very hard to cope with. What's going on today in the occupied Palestinian territory is something I would have never, ever fathomed. And still it's happening under the watch of the international community. This is what I find very difficult to deal with.
So, Francesca, this is Osama. Just a quick question to follow up on that point. Has the nature of the attack, is the attacks, are they the same whether you're in Europe, in America, in Australia, or are they from, do you have a different, how do you deal with the Italian people in Italy, for example, or in the United States, Canada? Is it the same attacks you've been subjected to over the years, or has it gotten much worse in this particular context where we are today after October 7th?
It has become stronger, yes, and it's more indecent now that are thousands of people who have been killed, and instead of talking about that, we talk about my character, my mandate, and my persona. So yes, it has intensified, but it's because also my role has been very visible since the 7th of October. Especially in the UN, there has been a lot of confusion and much silence. There have been very few people with an institutional function unpacking the right of, for example, Israel's right to defend itself. There were limits, and I've been very clear about that, together with other jurists. I've been very vocal on raising, together with other special rapporteurs, on raising the risk of genocide. And so, of course, this has reflected in an intensification of the attacks against me. It's been steady across certain countries in Europe where, let's say, there is also a greater alliance of the governments with Israel. For example, in Italy, in Australia, wherever I've been, there have been attacks. There were attacks using the same arguments. It seems like if there were talking points written somewhere and recited in different parts of the world, which is crazy because it would make us think that there is really someone drafting these talking points. I don't know, but again, the good thing is that you deal with the same idiocy across the globe in the same way, and once you have addressed one, you have addressed all.
Francesca, Sadi, if you want to jump in, please. But on the point of defense, Karim, do you want to, which we ask about the what's confusing to many of our listeners and to us, of course, is the question of Israel's right to defend itself. The whole idea of international law, if you could explicate this idea of the right to defend itself, and the question that always comes up by people on the Palestinian side is, do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? And then also, what does the right of defense in a settler colonial context, or is that even a legal category that even applies in these? So these are a bunch of questions that we're thinking through and we're not very clear about. The right to defend both sides, so on.
Okay, so let's start. Let's pretend, like many do, that everything started on the 7th of October. And we agree that this is not the case. So there was a context. This didn't happen in a vacuum, as the Secretary General has said. But let's imagine that everything started on the 7th of October with the heinous attack that Hamas launched against Israel. It was heinous because it did target, I don't know what was the intention, but it did target civilians. There are many civilians, hundreds of civilians who were killed, thousands who were injured, hundreds who were taken hostages, including young children, including babies and elderly. And I've unequivocally condemned these as war crimes. Israel, in response, certainly had the right to protect itself, had the right to repel the attack, had the right to arrest, detain, and prosecute those responsible, had the right to take all measures to protect itself, including to respond to rockets. How so? Through targeted interventions, so targeted strikes. This is something that could have been justified. The right to self-defense, though, it's not what, in legal terms, is not what we would understand as a synonymous of right to protect itself in common parlance, because in legalese, under the UN Charter, self-defense means something narrower and more specific and much wilder in a way. It's the right to wage a war. It's the right to use military force against another state when a state comes under attack. Let's leave for a second the fact that Israel never claimed that the attack emanated from a state. Let's leave it aside. The thing is that in international law, it's clear there is established jurisprudence that the right of self-defense, so the right of to wage a war, cannot be invoked against a non-state actor and against the population that is kept under belligerent occupation. So this established jurisprudence applies also to Israel, because the International Court of Justice established this principle, recalled this principle in 2004 in the advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the war. So while recognizing that there are threats, security threats, for the state of Israel emanating from the occupied territory, the court says you cannot wage a war against the Palestinians that are kept under belligerent occupation. So, and this is what should have limited Israel's operations from the very beginning. And instead, what has happened is that the entire Western community rallied around Israel to say, yeah, Israel has the right to defend itself, which legitimized the war against Gaza. But even if there was such a thing as a right to wage a war against Gaza, even if there should have been there were principles that would have prevented all what has happened. And again, this is not the case.
I was just going to ask Francesca, like on this question of, the status of Gaza, because sometimes the Israelis often the Israelis talk about Gaza as though it is another state, and they've declared various times since we've withdrawn in 2005. That's it. Now it's like this is a sovereign, although they don't recognize its sovereignty. Of course, it's like they want to have both. They want to have their cake and eat it. They want to say that it's not under our sovereignty, but yet it doesn't have its own sovereignty. But of course, at least some of us know from your work and other people's work too, Gaza still is occupied territory. So could you just rehearse the status, like Gaza's status in international law?
Yes, and then I will come back to what Osama asked about the right of the Palestinians to defend themselves. It's connected. So Gaza is still occupied, and the fact under international law, and the fact that Israel withdrew the colonies in 2005 doesn't mean that the territory is no longer occupied, because under international law, the presence of the colonies is foundational of colonization, not of occupation. The occupation exists when there is effective military control of one state over another or over a given territory. And effective control is not as it was like 100 years ago when, I mean, the only opportunity to control a territory was through troops on the ground, boots on the ground. Today, control can be exercised in other forms, and Israel maintains this control via the blockade it has imposed. But even you could have that control even without the blockade, because Israel maintains the control over the ground border, all accesses via land, which also determines a control of everything that enters and everything that exits Gaza, everyone who enters and exits Gaza. Control over the sea, which doesn't only mean control over the territorial sea. It's within Gaza Sea that Israel enters with its boats and patrols and even attacks Gaza's fishermen. There is control over the aerial space, the electromagnetic space. There is control of all the goods that get into Gaza, up to the point that Israel controls the calories that are allowed for the Gazans to feed themselves, how many medicines they can have, the equipment that hospitals can have. Everything is determined by Israel. And think that even the currency, the taxation system, the civil records are maintained by Israel. And last but not least, in 2005, when Israel withdrew the colonies, reserved itself the right to carry out preventive strikes. So it reserved itself the right to hit Gaza as it pleases and as it deems necessary. Of course, it's occupation. What else can it be? And this is an infringement of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people in what remains of their land. Now, if there is one thing on which the international community agrees, is that there should be a two-state solution on the 22% that remains of historical Palestine, that Israel didn't conquer in 1948. Fine, but that state cannot materialize without the right of self-determination, which means, in essence, the right of a people to be free and to exist as a people, politically determine themselves and their government, culturally, living their identity, including their religious identity, enjoying their cultural identity, or economically, meaning benefiting from the resources of the land over which the Palestinians should be able to govern over the territory without any control from outside. And Israeli occupation is quintessentially violates the right of self-determination through the annexation, fragmentation of the territory, the establishment of the colonies which suck all possible resources that Israel, even water, underground resources, arable and grazing land, everything is used by the Israelis, and including the offshore resources of the Gaza coastal area. There are natural gas and oil that are exploited or exploitable by Israel only. And the fact that, for example, the Palestinians cannot exist politically because there have been continuous interferences by Israel through targeted assassinations, through manipulation of the, let's say, the formation of an integral polity. I mean, even the divide between Fatah and Hamas has been fostered by Israel. And this is something that, in general, the Western community doesn't understand because we tend to suffer from amnesia. And but this is the reality. Without self-determination, there cannot be two states. The flip side of the right of self-determination is the right to resist. The Palestinians have the right to resist the oppression, the longest occupation of modern history, which doesn't mean inciting to violence, means recognizing that a people under occupation has the right to oppose itself to this oppression, of course, within the limits allowed by international law. This is recognized by the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions. This is recognized by the General Assembly. For example, Resolution 3236 refers to the right of the Palestinian to regain their rights in line with international law. So there is a recognition of the right to resist. But of course, we are no longer in the decolonization era. We are in the post 9/11 era. So talking of resistance is make people think of terrorism by default, which is wrong.
Could I ask just, Francesca, a very specific question? So the question of the Israeli on October 7th, what is the extent to which their right to self-defense at that moment, what does it extend to? What would they have been able to do that would have counted within self-defense?
Again, I don't think that the debate should be framed in terms of self-defense, because it really gives credit and leeway to the argument that everything started on the 7th of October. You know, Karim, I often mention the fact that during the 16 months I had been a special rapporteur before the 7th of October, 60 Israelis had been killed and 460 Palestinians. Israelis had been killed by Palestinian assailants, and the Palestinians had been killed by the Israeli army and armed Israeli settlers. So the situation was already violent. It was already an assault on the rights of the Palestinians. This doesn't justify the violence unleashed by Hamas. Also because I think it's unfair to claim that Hamas represents the Palestinian people as a whole. There should be elections to determine who represents the Palestinians. But whatever it was, Israel had the right to respond in terms of, what is the applicable legal framework? International humanitarian law, because Israel is still an occupying power. So there was a threat emanating from the territory that Israel occupies, and so there should have been a response in terms of reestablishing law and order. So repelling the attack. Second, capturing and arresting and detaining and prosecuting everyone who had been involved. There was, during an armed conflict or military operations, the right to life suffers some exceptions. So there wouldn't be necessary a judgment on Israel in using force, lethal force, against the combatants. Hamas operatives who were carrying out military operations on Israeli soil. But the question is, what's the purpose of using indiscriminate force, military force, against the entire civilian population in Gaza? Because this is what Israel did, and it didn't have the right to do so. I really want to point your attention to a report, an investigative report that came out of Israel recently. Journalist at Plus 972 revealed, you saw that report, it's shocking. It says that, I was shocked by reading that report because it confirmed some fears that I've had since the very beginning. Because as someone who has observed 5 subsequent wars in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and 2022. And I've read all 4 Commission of Inquiry reports. So there has always been a level of indiscriminate attacks against the population of Gaza, which was already under collective punishment because of the blockade, which was already a war crime enforced against the Palestinians. This is why I say it doesn't make sense to speak of right to self-defense, because whose right to self-defense is more relevant than the others. So I say, but again, the fact that Israel might have used artificial intelligence random sampling of the population to target is shocking. It's really shocking. And I don't know why it's not spoken enough at the international level, because this is something that should be thoroughly analyzed, and then it should inform political action.
But Francesca, if I can just go back to the question you said, it's a very important point. You say Palestinians I agree with what you said, and I'm sure all of us agree, but when you say Palestinians have a right to resist occupation under international law, but you're saying they also have to conform to international, so armed struggle, for example. I mean, these are very nebulous terms. These are terms that mean a lot. What does that mean? And what about the fact that Israelis is an armed settler a civilian, or are they soldiers? How does this work? I mean, these are questions that always come up for us and for people who listen.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and yeah.
Sorry, Francesca, if I could just to another way of asking Osama's question, to add to Osama's question, is how does international law work in the framework of a belligerent, not just a belligerent occupation, but a belligerent settler colonial enterprise specifically? Because because there's a specificity to it of these colonial outposts, or whatever you want to call them.
Yes, so let's unpack first what the occupation is and what are the forces that come into play. I argue that the occupation has been a vehicle to advance settler colonialism. I mean, I'm not the one who has made this argument. The Palestinians have denounced it all along. What I did with my first report was to try to discuss settler colonialism in a legal sense, saying that the right of self-determination, which is the right of all rights, is so violated by the nature of the occupation that makes it adds on to the argument of its overall illegality, meaning the illegality of the occupation. The occupation is settler colonial in nature because it has worked, again, as a vehicle to establish colonies after colonies. So the military necessity, where is the military necessity of Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory other than protecting the colonies? Arguably none. And this is key, because Israel confuses its right, probably I already said it, but Israel confuses the right to protect itself with the right to protect its annexation plan, its unrelinquished, its continuous territorial ambition in what remains of the Palestinian territory. And this is illegal. So the international community is the guarantor of the respect for international law. And it has miserably failed the Palestinians through and through, and the Israelis with them. Because look at the situation. There is no winner in the horror that has trapped Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory today. So the fact that the right to resist has limitations means that if the Palestinians target civilian objects, they commit war crimes as well. If they target military objects, they do not commit war crimes. They are in line with acts of resistance. Of course, but this has disappeared from the public debate because you have Western powers and Western media condemning every Palestinian action without even investigating what they have resulted into. So the killing of soldiers, frankly, it's a tragedy, but it's not a crime. And instead, very often when Palestinians manage to attack soldiers, they are portrayed as terrorists. And this is a misunderstanding that needs to be addressed in every opportunity for public debate. Let me just add one element. An illegal act of the resistance doesn't delegitimize the resistance itself, while an occupation which is illegal by its very nature, its very purpose, taints of illegality anything it does, including the claims for the right of self-defense.
That's a really important point, Francesca. I think that's a point that we should actually emphasize over and over again, the context and the illegality. But you haven't, so the question about the armed just to be clear, so what you're saying, under international law, as it's now framed, it seems that the Palestinian situation or situations of those who are under settler colonialism are in this vague space, in the sense that they can resist, you're saying, they have a right to resist, they have a right to armed struggle. I don't know if armed struggle is actually specified as a right of resistance, or if it's understood. And you're saying they have a right to attack soldiers. What about settlers who are armed? And then what about soldiers who are, for example, what Hamas did on October 7th? They go into Israel itself. They break the wall and they go through. Are those under international law? Are those considered to be legitimate? Leave aside what the Western media says and what Western governments say. Under international law, once they're in Israel itself, which of course is occupying Gaza, where does that fit in international law?
Let's stay on what Hamas did on the 7th of October. Had they targeted only military objectives, the situation would have been different. But the problem is that they targeted civilians. They, as far as what we hear in the media is true, because this is the thing. I mean, it's very difficult to also understand, to have clarity on what has happened. But let's assume that what they say in the media is true. Most of the victims were civilians. A soldier who's not on duty is a civilian. A reservist is a civilian. A soldier who's in active duty in a military basis and in absolving his functions, then it's a legitimate target in a context of armed conflict. But, for example, taking civilian hostages is always a crime. Taking soldiers as hostages might mean two things. They can be captured in combat and they are prisoners of war. But if they are soldiers taken just as a bargaining chip, this is illegal. So this is like a very dry analysis of what has happened on the 7th of October. Very, very basic. And again, basing myself on what comes through the media. The settlers. Now, everyone who takes up arms loses his or her civilian status. It applies to the Palestinians, it applies to the Israelis. This argument has never been properly spelled out. So the settlers are largely presented as civilians, but I think that they're not. And as they get involved, especially now that they have been provided weapons by some Israeli ministers, they lose their civilian status, in my view, as they are armed and attack Palestinians. But again, we are already discussing in a realm of emergency and of total failure of the UN, because the right of self-determination imposes obligations erga omnes. So it shouldn't be left to the Palestinians, who are the people under occupation, to protect themselves and to resist to one of the most powerful military powers in the world. It should be an international community taking solid, robust measures to ensure that the Palestinians' right of self-determination is realized. These would spare a lot of lives. This would pave the way toward peace and stability for both, which is what the international community not only has avoided like the plague, but has also created arguments to avoid dealing with. So this is why I say, for me, this is an epic failure of the international community.
Can I ask, because I think we're also very interested in the questions of the humanitarian law, but before that, just to be clear to myself, and I think to everybody, the colonies or the settlements under the law of occupation is illegal. The settlers that are, settlers that are on those settlements are illegally there. But for the purposes of resistance, let's say, the category becomes, if you are not armed at that moment, you are counted as a civilian, even in an illegal settlement, And so therefore you're protected as a civilian, even if you're on an illegal settlement and you know that you're there. So you know that you're breaking the laws of occupation. You still are only considered a legitimate target if you are carrying a gun, or if you're in the middle of if you're carrying some kind of armed, if you're an armed presence of some kind. Is this, just for clarification, is that?
Yes. This is my reading of international law, and I'm a human rights lawyer. So for me, the protection of people's life comes over and above states' consideration. But I think that this is very important, because eventually it's Israel's responsibility as a state to stop sustaining the colonies. For example, I do not call for the uprooting of all the settlers, in the sense the land that has been taken from the Palestinians should be returned. And that's it. And then the Palestinians will decide whether they want the land or they want to be compensated. But the land was taken against the law. That was crystal clear in 1967. Settlements are war crimes. So nothing good, they cannot be recognized. There are not consequences that could be recognized or should be recognized as legal, emanating from the colonies, the settlements. And there is a basic principle of international law, which is ex iniuria jus non oritur. So out of an illegal act, there is nothing legal that can germinate, and this applies there. However, the civilians who live in the colonies cannot be all held responsible, because many of them don't even realize that they are on illegal territory that it's illegally occupied. Because as of 1967, Israel has celebrated the expansion of its territory. There has been a jubilee in 1967, and the thing is that the Green Line, for example, which is very clear to us internationals, is not clear at all to the Israelis. The Israelis refer to the autonomous areas, like these pockets of land that are handled by the Palestinians, but many of them really have no knowledge of what occupied land is. Also because Israel has been very good at marking the water, for example, as it does Osama was asking me about I think it was Osama, Gaza presented by Israel as a hostile entity. This is the terminology that is created to deflect attention from what matters, the fact that the land is occupied, and by not calling it occupied, Israel avoid applying the only legal framework that would limit its actions, which is international humanitarian law, the law of occupation. Same thing with what happens in the rest of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But again, the fact that the Israelis do not know what's happening should be, I'm not justifying, I'm not excusing, but at the same time, I think that the state should be held responsible. All the more a call for action for the international community.
So, Francesca, why should anyone? I mean, given what you've laid out an extraordinarily persuasive case to us, of course. I mean, to anyone who knows the situation, the history, the context, everyone knows that the history didn't begin October 7th. But given the fact that the international law, as you said, has failed in terms of not the law but the application of law, and the UN has, and you said there's been an abandonment. I don't remember the phrase you used, but there was some phrase you used. The Palestinians have been left to their own devices to figure out and to live on this extraordinary situation, extraordinary violence. What do you say to people who say, like, for example, the Islamist resistance organizations that have sprung up, who basically say there's no point putting any faith in international law, and that there's an Islamic sort of resistance and that resistance is what is ethical, and don't put any faith in international law because it will never be applied. It'll never be applied fairly. It's never been applied fairly. It will never be applied fairly. So all these extraordinary distinctions that you've made and you've taught us and educated us today about, for example, the settler, armed or not armed, these are these nuances that you're talking about. How do you answer people who say, forget international law, it's never going to be applied fairly, A, and B, the Islamic resistance people who are saying the only thing that will teach or learn is armed struggle and resistance?
Two things. The first is that I've always thought, and now more than ever, that if you remove the framework of the Middle Eastern conflict, the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians epitomizes the relationship between the global north and the global south, a relationship that must be decolonized, because this is also the limitation of the human rights system. We struggle having a full application of human rights law, also because there are double standards, because Western countries transform rights into privileges, and using international law, as my predecessor Michael Link used to say, as a menu a la carte. This is a huge limitation, and the Palestinians pay the price, but together with many others. I don't think that people in the Sahel or people in Yemen or people in Iraq have experienced anything different, frankly. So, and this is why I think what's happening today to the Palestinians is resonating so strongly across the Middle East, across the global South, but also across Europe and across the rest of the West, because many of us see an Israelization, Palestinization of our societies, where we are not even free to use our right to protest, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, because there is a diktat imposed by politics. And so, again, this is why I'm saying Palestine is becoming a metaphor for a global revolution to, on the one hand, what remains of the world that needs to be decolonized, but on the other hand, the revolution for the full application of human rights. So I know that this might sound blah blah to many, because eventually, and this, we go to the second part of your question. Unfortunately, the betrayal of international law, the sacrifice of international law in its purest form, which is justice for all, has meant leaving space for radicalization. I've talked to many Palestinians throughout my 18 months as a special rapporteur, because I couldn't go to the occupied Palestinian territory, and still I've had hundreds of meetings with mothers, fathers, children, civil society actors, both Palestinians and Israelis. And what I hear from the Palestinians, my age, or people in their 40s, in their 30s, they fear the radicalization of the youth, which has much less physical and metaphorical horizon to imagine a different life than what they have. So yes, now what is left? It's violence. But this is why I say international law, not international, human rights remain like an argin to brutal violence, to violence in whatever forms. And this is why it's important that we regather around it in the interest of both Palestinians and Israelis. I keep on insisting. I try to push for a very inclusive language, because I think that both of them will pay. Although the suffering is different, the responsibility is different, but both of them are paying, and both of them will continue to pay. So in a way, it's again a case for all of us to make a stronger call to governments to apply human rights for all between the river and the sea. And this must not be seen as a call for destruction. It's a call for love. It's a call for recognition of humanity. the trauma and the pain of the other, as Amos Goldberg and Bashir Bashir say. And this is what we should all stand behind. Sorry, I talk a lot.
No. It's interesting that, as I was listening to what you're saying and about the UN and international law and the kind of the sort of the failure of the international community to uphold Palestinian rights, both at the human rights level and at the self-determination level, we see very often these kinds of attacks that come, for example, from this, what I consider to be the unhinged Israeli ambassador to the UN, attacking the Secretary General, calling him, I think he calls him an anti-Semite as well, and it goes from the Secretary General downwards, and perhaps most dangerously, sort of attacking UNRWA and the UN relief agency dealing with the Palestinian refugees, who are very active, obviously, in Gaza, and who are doing some amazing, incredibly sort of work in Gaza in general, but especially in this last period, and so many have been killed. And so this attempts and this pushing to dehumanize them and to throw them into the same lot that, like the Palestinians in Gaza, these UN staff are also basically Hamas. They're basically, and so therefore they're legitimate targets. What do you make of this thing where on the one hand, those of us maybe on this side are saying, well, we wish the UN would do more, and especially at the Security Council, especially the Secretary General, they're not saying enough. On the other hand, you have the Israelis who are launching these unbelievable attacks and calling them anti-Semites and effectively legitimizing their targeting inside Gaza, in the schools, in these areas. Is this something sort of unusual, or in other wars that's always been like this? The targeting of UN schools and UN staff, and saying, okay, yeah, we're doing this because they are basically they're combatants, and so they're legitimate targets.
Good question. Look, UNRWA has been targeted by vile smear campaigns for over 15 years now. I remember when I joined UNRWA, there was a huge campaign against the agency because of fostering anti-Semitism. And I've been involved for 6 months on the revision of UNRWA's human rights curricula. And through this revision, I've engaged with children of all ages in UNRWA schools in Gaza, in Lebanon, and Jordan and the West Bank, is Jerusalem. I didn't manage to go to Syria. And frankly, it's amazing the kind of breadth and the kind of openness that UNRWA's curricula gives to these children. So I think the campaign against UNRWA has always been vile and part of a larger plan to undo the agency, with the idea, which is another idiocy, that the Palestinian refugee question would go away just because UNRWA's disappear. UNRWA has played an important role also to stabilize the region. And I don't say that because without UNRWA, the Palestinians will be wild. No, the Palestinians are very calm. The Palestinians are very self-restrained. But UNRWA allows to be a vehicle to transfer certain values, UN values, over and above the local national curricula. Now, UNRWA has been targeted fiercely throughout Netanyahu's governments, but what they are doing now, it's really obnoxious, because UNRWA has been there, like providing critical aid at the dangerous moment. UNRWA has lost more than 100 staff members, and it feeds the kind of narrative that we have seen, feeds this binary view of the world made of good and bad. And yeah, I mean, without excluding the possibility that some UNRWA staff member, because UNRWA is the major employer in the Gaza Strip, might have done something that is not in line with UNRWA's rules. This doesn't incriminate, and it shouldn't incriminate the agency as a whole. UNRWA has been particularly targets, including in terms of facilities, premises. There there have been the bombing of UNRWA premises while it was sheltering children and women. So all of these, I just look for the day there will be justice, a proper investigation and accountability. And I long for the day the people who have orchestrated this carnage in Gaza will pay, because that day will come, I hope.
What needs to change, Francesca? Oh, sorry. What needs to change for that, to get to that point? Or Sadi, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask. I mean, we share all three of us, and the world beyond, I think, shares your fervent belief that justice should be done. But those of us looking at it without your perspective of international law, you know much more about the details than we do. But look, we keep and you could say maybe we're being naive, but where's the International Criminal Court? Where's the International Court of Justice? Why are they not seeing what we're seeing? And from our now admittedly naive perspective, it's like, why is nothing happening? Why did nothing happen 2008, 9, 2014, 2000? I mean, you know the list better than I do. What would it take? I've heard some journalists say, for example, we need some nation to invoke the genocide, the Genocide Convention, and that will kind of press up a button that will make something else happen that hasn't yet happened. That will kind of expedite the legal process of bringing justice about. But like, how are those of us who are committed to justice, as all of us are, how are we to understand the inaction, not just in theory of the UN or of international law as a kind of body, but specifically of the courts that, to our perhaps naive minds, are empowered to actually investigate and do something, rather than just, as we're doing, at least as I'm doing, wringing our hands saying, what's happening? Where's the world of justice?
Okay, let's start with International Criminal Court. Because the court has jurisdiction over the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory since 2014. And as of 2021, the Office of the Prosecutor has officially opened an investigation, right, over that situation. But we know that there was a very small budget, and we know that it was not a priority for the Office of the Prosecutor until the 7th of October. Because a few weeks after the 7th of October, we have seen the prosecutor going to the region, and it has also done a second visit to Israel, although Israel is not party to the Rome Statute. But the prosecutor has gone first to Israel to express its solidarity to the victims of the 7th of October attacks. And then it has gone to the West Bank to meet with the Palestinian authorities. So I personally have an issue with it, because the Office of the Prosecutor should not have gone to the region without having access to all places where the conflict or the violations of international law that might amount to international crimes are reported to occur. This is my take. He should have gone to Gaza. But also, again, I hope that the prosecutor doesn't only focus on the 7th of October, because he has already made statements on what he thinks occurred on the 7th of October when it comes to Hamas. Because this is the thing, everyone is sort of exercises restraint when it comes to commenting on the conduct of Israel. But everyone has a very clear view on what are the crimes that Hamas has committed. We don't even have a full picture of what has happened, but we all hold the view, including myself, that Hamas committed war crimes. So just to say. And again, this is why there are so many people who are criticizing, at the international level, the Office of the Prosecutor, because of course this conduct casts a shadow on the impartiality of the court. I truly hope he will correct it. So this is the court, the International Criminal Court. The action has been delayed, and now, of course, everyone is worried the let's say the breadth and the scope of the investigation. Also because the prosecutor made a comment on the violent settlers that he knows are part of the violence in the West Bank. But the problem is not the violent settlers. The problem is with the settlements. Even the non-violent settlements are a problem because they are the backbone of the structural violence imposed on the Palestinians. This is one. The second element is that there is something extraordinarily important, which is universal jurisdiction. Many countries have the opportunity to prosecute through domestic courts war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And these courts should be activated. And I'm so relieved to see that these efforts are starting. There was already a submission made in Norway. There are discussions happening in other parts of the world. This is a venue that should be tried because it might be even faster than the ICC. Then another thing is that there are many double nationals, people fighting in the IDF or people partaking in violence as armed settlers, because 60% of the settlers are from Europe and the United States, or I mean Western countries, 60%. So these are double nationals, and so they should also be held accountable in their own other country of nationality than Israel. This is an opportunity that, in my view, remains untapped. Whether genocide is, invoking genocide to push for action. Look, I think this is a semantic question because atrocity crimes must be prevented. So when there are crimes being committed, there should be a strong response of the international community, no matter what. There should be diplomatic measures, economic measures, and political measures taken against the country which commits wrongdoings and potentially crimes and potentially atrocities. When it comes to Israel, there is a sort of a wall of denialism. So we say, yeah, but we need to wait for the International Court of Justice to activate. This is just a way to kick the can in the air, in my view. There is not even necessary to wait for the UN Security Council. Countries at the regional level or individually can take their own measures and suspend, for example, relations with Israel, like, for example, some countries in Latin America have done, or advocate for the suspension of Israel's in political fora, or for economic measures. I mean, again, in Europe, we still have settlement goods labeled. They shouldn't be in our markets at all, let alone the fact that they are labeled. They shouldn't be in European markets because they emanate from war crimes. So this is the kind of radical discussion that we should be having.
Can you clarify one thing, Francesca, on the ICC? Because a lot of people, I get asked the question, and you're the expert on this. So the Israelis and the Americans, for that matter, are not member states. They have not ratified, so they're not member states. But Palestine or the Palestinian territories are. So anything that occurs in the Palestinian territory can be reviewed by the ICC, right? That's just on a technical level. Is there what is the extent to which, if a prosecution goes ahead, the extent to which proceedings would end up, because this is for individuals, right? It's not for a state. This is not the ICC doesn't go after a state or a government or an authority. It goes after individuals, and presumably at the higher levels, not at the or will they also go at the lower levels, at the level of the individual soldiers, or do they tend to focus on those giving the orders, let's say? And the second question is, what about those that support? So there's a lot of discussion that this is effectively an American-Israeli war in Gaza. At least a lot of people kind of make that argument. Is there a sense of the possibility of accountability for those leaders who are quite clearly pushing on what is at least war crimes, if we don't want to use the terms of genocide or this kind of thing. Would such a court have jurisdiction to also bring in people who are outside the territories but are kind of inflaming or are contributing materially through weapons, through other things like this, in an ongoing war which has war crimes? I mean, again, whether you call it genocide or crime against humanity or war crimes, I'm just curious about this, as far as you know.
Yes, Israeli, yes, in general, the court goes to the higher chain of command. This is the practice, but also for a question of resources, because the court doesn't have the capacity to try everyone. And the retributive justice is never perfect, especially after mass atrocities. But it's understood that targeting those at the highest echelon is a way to also help the people, the victims, close the circle somewhat, and then for the society to reestablish itself on a, let's say, on a more just path. There is the possibility, of course, to investigate and indict Israeli leaders, political and military leaders, because of the crimes committed in the occupied Palestinian territory, if confirmed. Of course, this is what the investigation of the ICC will result in. There is a case that has been filed by an American organization against the U.S. administration for complicity with the crimes that Israel might be committing. And again, I look at it with interest. It's surely something that should be looked at, because the fact that there is an obligation in the Genocide Convention, there is an obligation to prevent genocide, which means that if there is active support to a state which might commit genocide, then there has been a clear violation of that obligation to prevent genocide. So I think there is ground for a solid investigation. But of course, it is to be done. So the main hindrance factor is political will, because of course, as there has always been, there will continue to be pressure on the court unless and until there is counter pressure. And this is why the civil society mobilization worldwide, especially from American Jews in the US and other groups, it's so important, because it's really a sort of an awakening call for many. And there should be a responsabilization of many countries, so to activate themselves and put also not pressure on the ICC, but to put pressure on Western states to stop this continuous sheltering of Israel from its responsibilities. And let me say just one last thing. I mean, whatever we are saying shouldn't be read as anti-Israelism. Personally, I don't have anything against the state of Israel. I don't call for the end of the state of Israel. I just want that Israel behaves in accordance with international law, and cannot operate by discriminating and oppressing the Palestinians wherever they are.
So I think we need to probably wrap up, but can I just ask one last question from me, and then I don't know, just to go back to what we started with. In over these 60 days now that this war has been going on, and of course, want to thank you for reminding us all that things didn't start on October 7. There's a long history of occupation that's been going on. So this is obviously the most important thing for us to realize. But on the specifics of this, is there the kind of the sense when you're going around and you're talking to people and you're doing the rounds both in media but also in UN circles and in presumably among diplomats and others that have this kind of impact, do you get the sense that they are looking at what's going on, at this incredible carnage that's going on, this I mean, at least from the outside, fairly obvious breaking of international humanitarian law at all sorts of levels. Even by the Israelis, I mean, they talk about it. They literally talk genocidal language. I mean, it seems kind of bizarre that they are saying it. It's not even like I need to say something. I mean, you can just and people are compiling on Twitter and other things. They're just compiling lists of all these different ministers and MPs and people who are literally saying, we want to ethnically cleanse. We want to get rid of this. What are they? Monsters and human animals and, all this kind of language. And Netanyahu with this bizarre kind of Old Testament kind of discussions. So yes. So the question is, do you see over these 30, 40 days that things have changed? Like, are you hearing less pushback on the need for a ceasefire, on a need for accountability, on the need to stop all of this thing? Or is it sort of the same and everybody's trying to turn around and look, the Security Council, nothing is happening. The Security Council seems to have disappeared as far as I can tell. They put out this resolution which was extremely weak, and I found something even worse than weak. They legitimized this notion of humanitarian pauses, whatever that was. So kind of, for me anyway, it legitimized the sense of they're allowed to kind of continue this kind of merciless bombing as long as they, in principle, talk about some kind of pause. But so has not in your meetings, even behind closed doors, not in the media, do you sense anything changing, or is it exactly as it was in terms of the pushback to you, in terms of the attacks on you, in terms of what people are saying? I'm not talking about the fringe or the kind of right-wing stuff or the Israeli pushback, but within the circles that you're also advocating and trying to do something.
Yeah, I think that it really depends in the sense that in the media, things have changed. In the sense, in the beginning, I found it astonishing, the fact that they could even start interviews with me. I mean, an independent expert of the UN. There was this aggressive question: do you condemn Hamas?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's the first question.
I do.
Yes.
Why are you asking? But why are you asking? I mean, it was very annoying. Because I'm also very sensitive. I could read the assumption in their mind that I would not condemn. How do you dare? How do you dare? I mean, this was the frustration I had in the beginning. There's been, that I think that this has changed a little bit. There is a sort of shock among media, because also they understand that the situation is very serious and they don't know how to handle it, because there is also a sort of illiteracy. I don't think that everyone understands how profound this injustice is and how profound is the dehumanization of the Palestinians. But again, we go back to what I was saying in the beginning. I do know profoundly that genocide is a process and not an act. And genocide, you remember I was saying, as a European, I know that the genocide of the Jewish people would have not been possible without the centuries of persecutions that preceded it. The genocide of the Herero population in Namibia and other African communities would have not been able to happen without the profound dehumanization of these people, seen as uncivilized and savages, and so I'm very worried about what I see now, and this is why I try to explain it calmly and really through a piecemeal approach to the media, and they don't necessarily get all this. But again, this is the mainstream media. Many of them are also embarrassed because they don't know how to correct now the narrative that they have contributed to spread. But there are also small, less mainstream media who have always done an egregious job and continue to do so. So we should acknowledge that. And the civil society has been amazing, but also society in general. I think that it really makes me proud to see so many Europeans taking the street and risking also their life, because in many countries it's prohibited to take the street and act in solidarity with Palestinian rights. At the political level, it depends. There are people who really live in an alternative reality, as I keep on saying. They don't get it. And because, again, I think that there is profound racism and deep-rooted racism and deep-rooted anti-Palestinian racism. So it's not only the Israelis who have dehumanized the Palestinians. It's Western media and Western politicians. Oh my God, the condescendence that I encounter sometimes is mind-blowing. But there are also those who really see the challenges and would like to change the reality. They just don't know what to do. There is a lack of leadership. And this is why I am upset with the United Nations, because now more than ever, we need leaders to say, hey, we need a ceasefire. And while a stable ceasefire, meaning cessation of hostilities. And meanwhile, there should be an evacuation plan for all the people in Gaza who will not be able to stay in Gaza, starting with the double nationals, those who are heavily injured, traumatized, but with an assurance that they will be able to return to the last piece of Palestine that remains to them. And so there should be a mechanism in place to make it happen. And demilitarization of Hamas can be discussed, but there should be a demilitarization of the occupied Palestinian territory. This is the opportunity to end the military occupation of Israel in the Palestinian territory. And for this to happen, there should be a peacekeeping operation. I mean, these are my ideas, but I think these are things that could be discussed. And there should be the kind of leadership at the UN level or somewhere else proposing this kind of discussion with other ideas, of course. And there is not such a thing at the moment.
Well, you opened up so many questions that we need to end. I mean, responsibility to protect, peacekeeping. You're just now hinting at that. It's a whole other discussion. Not sure if my
we can have another discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have the Makdisi and the Albanese.
Yes, exactly. That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. So, Sari, do you want to wrap us up?
But thank you, Francesca. Thank you for all the work and honestly for this this really illuminating discussion. I've learned quite a bit and really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again, and hopefully we'll stay in touch, and we'll very, very gladly take up your offer to have you on again.
Anytime.
Excellent.
We'll ask tougher questions next time,
and I will give tougher answers.
Thank
All
you.
the best.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
very much. Bye.